Your Honor, the accused was apprehended attempting to steal a loaf of bread from a neighborhood store, the prosecutor said with icy detachment. The man merely lowered his gaze. I just needed enough strength to survive another day. The courtroom let out a few stifled laughs, but the judge remained silent. He had just heard the man's name, and something shifted in his eyes. Who was this man, and why did the judge's face suddenly look so shaken? Raymond Ellis, 64 years old, had become a quiet presence in a corner of Philadelphia he'd wandered for nearly 11 years. Gaunt and sun-worn, his graying beard wild from years without care. He carried with him a tattered army-style backpack, faded blue with broken straps that had clearly once belonged to a soldier. Locals knew him as the silent drifter. Unlike others experiencing homelessness, who often asked for spare change or drew attention in louder ways, Raymond rarely spoke. He gathered cans for recycling, occasionally accepted extra food from kind-hearted cafe staff, and rotated his sleeping spots to avoid trouble with any single storefront. What most never realized was that Raymond had once been a U.S. Air Force technician, having served over 2 decades before being honorably discharged in 2003. When his wife, Linda, passed away from cancer in 2007, an illness initially misidentified by a government clinic, Raymond crumbled under the weight of grief. He refused support from his siblings, sold their small condo, donated every cent to an animal shelter his wife had adored, and faded into the city's shadowed corners. Sometimes it's easier to be forgotten than to live with the memory of letting someone down, he confided once to a shelter volunteer. On a frigid December morning, with the wind cutting sharp and snow beginning to fall, Raymond slipped into Dalton's grocery. He hadn't eaten in nearly 4 days. His fingers trembled as he tucked a discounted loaf of rye bread into his coat, hoping no one would notice while Mr. Dalton assisted a regular customer. But a new security camera had just been installed. Hey, hold it right there, Dalton barked, already reaching for the receiver. I'm calling this in. Raymond didn't flee. He stood still, the edge of the bread peeking from his half-zipped coat. I just needed enough to make it through today, he murmured. 2 officers arrived within moments. The younger one, Officer Mendez, looked visibly uneasy as he fastened cuffs around the old man's thin wrists. You really a vet? Mendez asked, eyeing the worn metal tag hanging around Raymond's neck. The ID was barely legible. Raymond gave a slow nod. I used to be someone who mattered. Not anymore. I'm sorry, sir, but I have to bring you in, Officer Mendez said gently. The store owner's pressing charges, says this isn't your first time. At the station, Raymond was booked like any other small-time offender. A public defender stopped by briefly, but it was clear his mind was already on the next dozen files waiting on his desk. Raymond was given a court appearance scheduled for the next morning, a quick arraignment where the formal charges would be read. When the day came, Raymond was led into a Philadelphia municipal courtroom, still dressed in the same worn clothes from the night before, now crumpled and marked with sleep. No relatives sat in the benches. No one had shown up to speak on his behalf. Just a few scattered attorneys, journalists interested in more high-profile hearings, and clerks moving through their routines. Case number 38107. Commonwealth versus Raymond Ellis, the clerk mumbled without much interest. A young prosecutor, barely out of law school, stood up and adjusted his collar. Your Honor, the accused was caught attempting to steal a loaf of bread from a corner grocery. Due to previous minor thefts and lack of a permanent address, we request that he remain in custody until trial. The judge, Honorable Frederick Hanover, known in the city for his strict demeanor and fast-paced hearings, skimmed the top sheet of the file without even glancing at Raymond. To most in the room, this was just another routine case involving a vagrant. Mr. Ellis, how do you plead? Judge Hanover finally asked, lifting his eyes. Guilty, Your Honor, Raymond answered quietly. I was just hungry. A chuckle came from someone seated near the back, but it stopped quickly when the judge shot a cold glare across the courtroom. He returned to the paperwork, flipping to the page with identification details. Raymond James Ellis, former technical sergeant, United States Air Force. His voice slowed as he read. The air in the courtroom seemed to shift. The judge's eyes stopped scanning. His hand, gripping the bench, tightened until his knuckles turned pale. He looked at Raymond, then at the folder again, then back to the man in cuffs. Without offering a word of explanation, Judge Hanover abruptly stood up. Confusion rippled through the room as the silence deepened. Everyone froze. Judges don't usually rise during standard hearings, but for several tense seconds, Judge Hanover remained on his feet, his expression tight with something that looked like disbelief or pain. "Your Honor," the prosecutor asked cautiously, unsure of the protocol when a judge abruptly stands without declaring recess. "Court will break for 15 minutes, Judge Hanover said, his voice raspier than before. "The defendant stays." He exited swiftly, leaving a room full of murmurs behind. Raymond remained motionless, eyes downcast, either unaware or indifferent to the sudden shift caused by the mere mention of his name. What do we really think about war heroes who serve with honor only to be forgotten on the sidewalks of our cities? Stay with us, because what happened next left everyone stunned. Inside his private chambers, Judge Frederick Hanover opened a lower drawer in his desk and retrieved an old, creased photo. A dusty group of uniformed men in desert gear stood posed in front of a makeshift medical post, taken somewhere in the sands of Iraq. His fingers trembled slightly as his eyes found his own younger face among them. He'd been a field medic back then, 2 decades earlier, long before law school and the bench. And standing tall in the top row was Raymond Ellis. The judge turned to his desktop and accessed the secure veteran registry he still used occasionally from his advisory work with military legal aid. A quick search brought up a detailed service file. Technical Sergeant Raymond Ellis had completed 3 deployments, 2 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, coordinating logistical routes to forward bases during the most perilous phases of both wars. He'd been awarded the Bronze Star for bravery in 2004 when his convoy was ambushed en route to Fallujah. Instead of fleeing, Ellis had taken control of a burning transport, steering it away from the wounded while suffering burns and shrapnel himself. 17 lives had been saved that day. The file included a grainy press photo that once headlined the Washington Post: Ellis, cradling an injured Afghan child, sprinting toward a medevac chopper during a humanitarian relief op. For a brief moment, he had embodied the quiet valor of American service. But what stopped the judge cold was a recently declassified mission note from August 2004. During an emergency evacuation under heavy fire, Raymond Ellis had carried a wounded medic, Private First Class Frederick Hanover, over 2 miles to the extraction point, despite bleeding from his own injuries. "God," the judge whispered, "it's him." For years, Judge Hanover had wondered who that soldier was, the one who'd refused to leave him behind. He only remembered the call sign Ellis shouted amid the chaos. After discharge, the judge had tried to find him, but there had been no trace, no home, no records. Raymond had simply vanished. Back in the courtroom, Raymond sat quietly while the bailiff scrawled on his phone. 15 years had passed since Raymond began drifting through the edges of society, unseen by the very nation he once risked his life for. After Linda died, swallowed by a slow cancer the VA failed to detect in time, Raymond unraveled. Grief consumed him, made worse by untreated trauma from years of service. His faith in the system collapsed, so he walked away from his pension, his home, his identity, from everything. He couldn't stomach the same red tape that had failed the person he loved most. For years, people in the area had dismissed him as nothing more than a nuisance. Teenagers sometimes hurled scraps of food at him for sport. Store owners sprayed down the spots where he tried to sleep. Police officers routinely shooed him away whenever neighbors called to complain. Even others experiencing homelessness tended to avoid the quiet man who sometimes woke up screaming in the night. Raymond managed to get by collecting cans and bottles, scraping together just enough money to buy cheap cough syrup when the winter air left his lungs aching. He never begged, never asked for help. His military discipline had ingrained in him a sense of self-sufficiency that refused to fade no matter how harsh life became. On the hardest nights, Raymond would take out the photograph of Linda, carefully sealed in plastic, worn but intact. "Almost there, Linz," he'd whisper, holding on with everything he had. Back in his office, Judge Hanover was making calls, first to the VA department to urgently confirm Raymond's military record, then to Colonel Jonathan Myers, who had served alongside both men years earlier. "John, it's Fred Hanover. I found him, the man who carried me out during that Fallujah ambush. He's here, in my courtroom, living on the street, facing theft charges." The pause on the other end said everything before Myers finally replied, "I'm about 3 hours away. Don't let him leave." The judge sat down and began to write, using official court stationery. Raymond Ellis is not just another homeless defendant. He is a reflection of devotion, neglected by the very nation he risked everything to defend. Though judicial protocol prevented him from throwing the case out based on personal involvement, nothing stopped him from redirecting its course entirely. As the break came to a close, the judge's clerk noticed something new on her desk, a printed copy of the once iconic image of Raymond carrying the Afghan child, now paired with a handwritten message at the bottom. "Some heroes never asked to be remembered." She instantly recognized the handwriting. Colonel Myers, who had previously corresponded with the court on veterans' legal matters. It was all falling into place. Raymond Ellis wasn't just a nameless man in need of mercy. He was someone whose quiet bravery had left an imprint on people now in positions to rewrite his fate. When court resumed, Raymond immediately sensed a shift. The judge no longer wore the distant, stoic mask of the previous day. Instead, his eyes held something else, something Raymond hadn't seen directed at him in years. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to acknowledgement, respect. Before Raymond could fully process the change, the direction of the hearing unexpectedly shifted. In light of newly surfaced details concerning the defendant's service record, this court will delay further proceedings until a full review can be conducted, Judge Hanover declared. The defendant will remain in custody until tomorrow's session. The prosecutor looked momentarily unsure, but voiced no objections. Raymond, used to institutions making decisions over his head and without explanation, merely nodded. As deputies began escorting him out, the judge added firmly, "And ensure Mr. Ellis receives a hot meal and medical care this evening." That afternoon, a small local news site ran a skeptical headline, "Homeless Man Claims War Hero Passed. Judge Postpones Sentencing Over Stolen Bread." The article's comment section quickly filled with biting opinions. "Another scam artist pretending to be military," one wrote. "If he really served, why isn't he getting VA support instead of stealing from shopkeepers?" At the county facility, Raymond faced more than words. A younger inmate who had read the article on a contraband smartphone confronted him. "You're a disgrace," the young man hissed, shoving Raymond into the wall. "My brother died in Mosul while people like you pretend you earned the uniform." Raymond didn't strike back. He'd spent years enduring the world's silent contempt. This was just another bruise in a long line. That night, he didn't touch the dinner they brought. He lay on his cot holding two things, his battered military tags and the photograph of Linda, the edges soft from years of handling. For the first time in ages, he wondered, why now? Why had someone finally looked at him and actually seen who he was? Have you ever known someone wrongly judged just by their appearance? Sometimes, sharing those stories reminds us how easily we look away from people who deserve to be seen. The next morning, Raymond was brought back into the courtroom, unaware that something far beyond his case was unfolding. Unlike the day before, every seat in the gallery was now occupied. Reporters and camera crews hovered outside, barred from entry but ready to capture whatever came next. Raymond's confusion grew when he noticed his court-appointed lawyer had vanished. In his place stood a seasoned attorney, tailored suit, polished shoes, and calm authority in his voice. "Richard Harlow," he said, extending a firm handshake, "Veterans Legal Defense Alliance. Someone has taken a strong interest in your case, Mr. Ellis." He offered no further explanation. As Raymond sat down at the defense table, The doors at the rear of the courtroom swung open again. People rose. Judge Hanover entered. But Raymond's eyes were drawn to what followed. Three military officers in full formal dress, their medals gleaming, entering quietly behind the court desk. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Frederick Hanover," the bailiff called out. Everything about the moment felt heightened, reverent. The judge settled in and addressed the room with a gravitas absent the day before. "Before we proceed with the formal charges against Mr. Ellis," he said, "this court will hear testimony relevant to the defendant's service history, which may significantly impact the path forward." Raymond sat frozen as Colonel Jonathan Myers approached the stand. Time had aged him, his hair now mostly gray, but his posture, his voice, his presence were unmistakably military. He was no longer just a superior officer, he was a witness. After being sworn in, Myers turned toward the court and spoke with the same measured clarity Raymond remembered from 2 decades before. "I'm Colonel Jonathan Myers, currently assigned to Fort Belvoir," the officer began, his voice steady and authoritative. "I've known the defendant, Technical Sergeant Raymond Ellis, since our joint deployment to Iraq back in 2004. Myers turned his eyes directly to Raymond. "This man saved 17 lives. When our convoy was ambushed outside Ramadi under intense enemy fire, he took the wheel of a fuel truck already in flames and drove it away from the others. He suffered serious burns to his back and arms, but he stopped what would have been a catastrophic explosion." A wave of murmurs spread across the courtroom. Myers continued without pause. Later that same day, Sergeant Ellis carried a wounded medic, a young private first class named Frederick Hanover, over 2 miles to safety, despite a shrapnel injury in his own leg. At that, every gaze shifted to Judge Hanover. His stoic expression flickered as he slowly nodded, silently confirming the account. The prosecutor stood, visibly tense. "Your Honor, while I acknowledge this testimony speaks volumes about the defendant's prior service, it does not negate the fact that a theft occurred." "If I may finish," Colonel Myers interjected. "After examining Mr. Ellis's military record, we uncovered a substantial administrative failure. Following a system transition in 2009, his pension and medical coverage were mistakenly terminated due to forms sent to a residence he no longer occupied. For the past 14 years, Mr. Ellis should have been receiving just under $1,400 monthly in compensation, in addition to full medical benefits for service-related injuries. The total unpaid support exceeds $230,000. A heavy silence gripped the courtroom. Raymond sat frozen, his hands locked to the edge of the table. "Moreover," Myers added, pulling a file from his case, "we have written statements from 5 members of his former unit, all affirming his integrity and sacrifice, including this letter from General McAllister, who credits Mr. Ellis with saving his son during that same ambush." Judge Hanover looked directly at Raymond for the first time. "Mr. Ellis, would you please step forward?" Raymond hesitated, then slowly rose. The judge continued. "Ordinarily, judicial procedure would require me to recuse myself from any case involving someone with whom I share a personal history. But I did not recognize you yesterday. Only after reviewing your records did I realize that you are the man who pulled me from the battlefield 2 decades ago." A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. The judge removed his glasses, his voice softer now, almost reverent. "I've spent years searching for the soldier who saved my life. All I ever knew was a single name, shouted through chaos: Ellis." Raymond's voice, when it finally came, was hoarse from years of silence. "I was just doing my duty, sir," Raymond said quietly. "You did far more than your duty," the judge replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And this nation has failed in its duty to you." Judge Hanover turned toward the prosecution table. "Given these exceptional revelations, does the state intend to pursue charges?" The young prosecutor, now visibly shaken, rose to his feet. "Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Ellis, with prejudice." "So ordered," the judge said without hesitation. "Mr. Ellis, you are free to go, and this court extends its deepest apologies for a failure of justice that extends far beyond the walls of this courtroom." As Raymond stood, still too stunned to speak, the courtroom doors opened once again. A woman in her 30s entered, scanning the room until her eyes locked on him. She moved slowly down the aisle, tears spilling freely. "Uncle Raymond," she whispered, "I'm Sarah, Linda's niece. We've been trying to find you for years." Raymond's composure finally gave way. His shoulders slumped, and when Sarah wrapped her arms around him, he melted into the embrace, the first human contact in years that wasn't from a cold pair of handcuffs. Outside the courthouse, the media waited. Reporters clustered around Colonel Myers, pushing microphones in his direction. "This isn't about just one man," Myers declared. "This is about the thousands of Raymond Ellises who vanish into the cracks of the very system they swore to protect. Today, we take the first step in fixing that." By midday, the story had gone viral. Helicopters hovered above the courthouse. News anchors debated the case in real time. When Raymond stepped outside, freshly shaven and wearing donated clothes, he was flanked by Judge Hanover, now recused but present in personal capacity, and Colonel Myers. The crowd parted as a man pushed forward. It was Mr. Dalton, the grocer who had reported the theft. "I didn't know," he said, voice breaking. "I just saw someone stealing and assumed the worst. I'm ashamed of myself." Raymond gave a small nod, too overwhelmed to speak. Within 2 days, a national veterans group launched a fundraiser in Raymond's name. Donations surged past $180,000. Online, people began sharing their own stories of fathers, sisters, uncles who had returned from service only to be lost in bureaucratic silence. Under public pressure, the Department of Veterans Affairs announced a nationwide audit of suspended benefit accounts. In a quiet hallway, away from flashing cameras and press microphones, Judge Hanover finally had the conversation he had waited nearly 20 years to finish. "You carried me for over 2 miles with shrapnel in your leg," he said softly. "The medics told me you refused treatment until they had stabilized me." Raymond shrugged slightly. "You were in worse shape." The judge looked him in the eye. "You said something to me back then when I was fading in and out. You told me to keep breathing, kid. Your story isn't over. I held on to that for years. It kept me going. It gave me purpose." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. And then, without ceremony or fanfare, Judge Hanover placed a hand on Raymond's shoulder, the quiet acknowledgement of a debt finally paid in full. "I became a judge because I wanted to keep serving, like you did," Judge Hanover said. Raymond looked at him, and for the first time, he didn't see the black robe or the bench. He saw the trembling young medic from a battlefield long ago. "I'm glad something good came out of that day," Raymond said softly. "Not just something good," the judge replied. "Everything good, my career, my family, my ability to make a difference. None of it would have happened if you hadn't carried me out of that fire. You gave me a second life." For the first time in years, a genuine smile formed on Raymond's face, one that reached all the way to his eyes. "No man left behind," he said. "That wasn't just a phrase to me." 3 days later, Raymond stood in the judge's private chambers, wearing a crisp new suit. For the first time, the medals on his chest told the story that had gone untold for so long. His Bronze Star, his Purple Heart, and ribbons from campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. A representative from the Department of Veterans Services was there to formally present him with back pay and a settlement for the years of lost benefits. Cameras clicked as Raymond addressed the press, his voice firm. "I don't want anyone's pity," he said. "I just hope that no one else who served this country ends up forgotten like I was." What had started as a quiet story of a stolen loaf of bread had become a national reckoning. Lawmakers cited Raymond's case on the Senate floor while introducing new legislation to overhaul veteran benefits. The photo of Raymond carrying the injured Afghan child began recirculating, this time paired with an image of him sleeping on a city sidewalk. The contrast sparked headlines and uncomfortable questions about what America values and who it remembers. Raymond Ellis, once invisible for over a decade, had become a face no one could ignore. What's a moment where justice came late but mattered deeply when it arrived? Share your story. Someone out there might need it. 6 months later, Raymond moved into a newly built housing community for veterans in Brooklyn. The small apartment was modest, but it was his first real home since Linda passed. On one wall, a quiet tribute took shape. A photo from their wedding day, another of his old unit in the desert, and a new picture, Raymond standing beside Judge Hanover at a local veteran recognition ceremony. He turned down most interview requests, but accepted invitations to speak at nearby schools, sharing stories of service, sacrifice, and what it truly means to come home. His quiet dignity and plain-spoken honesty resonated deeply with troubled youth, especially teenagers who saw in him not a lecturer, but a man who had lived through both honor and hardship. He never preached, he simply shared. Each afternoon, Raymond could be found sitting on a bench in Franklin Park, watching kids play. It was often the very same bench where years earlier he had curled up on freezing nights when doorways offered little shelter. Outside the Philadelphia courthouse, a new bronze plaque was mounted near the steps. It read, "Justice means remembering those we once overlooked." Next to the inscription stood a bronze relief, a sculpture of Raymond carrying the injured medic who would later become Judge Hanover, with the American flag waving behind them. During the dedication ceremony, the city's mayor announced the launch of an annual fund to provide free legal advocacy for unhoused veterans. It was named the Ellis Initiative. That same week, a 10-year-old boy who had often seen Raymond collecting bottles wrote an essay for his school paper. "Not everyone wearing ragged clothes is dangerous. Some people wear memories instead." The essay went viral, won a citywide competition, and was later read aloud during a city council hearing on housing reform. Raymond remained close with Judge Hanover and often joined his family for Sunday dinners. At one of those meals, the judge's young son looked at him and asked, "Aren't you mad about being homeless for so long?" Raymond thought for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't want pity. I just hope the next ones aren't forgotten the way I was." On Veterans Day, Raymond stood proudly at Fort Belvoir in full dress uniform, the first time he had worn it in over 20 years. When asked to speak, his words were few but powerful. "I once served this nation," he said, "and now this nation has chosen to serve me back." His voice grew stronger as he added, "Kindness is never too late. It just takes someone willing to wait for it." As he stepped down from the podium, the entire assembly, young soldiers, retired officers, and military families rose in a unified, silent salute. Raymond squared his shoulders and returned it, standing tall. His gaze was no longer cast downward. It was fixed forward, steady and clear, because sometimes justice is delayed, but never denied. Don't lose faith when you're standing for what's right. Share the moment you held your ground when the world pushed back. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Blackground, where truth and justice still matter. Share this with someone who needs to believe in doing the right thing.